Welcome to our 2020 Predictions, Perceptions, and Expectations webinar. This is the first for the Marketing Society in these challenging times, and we're here with Mick Gordon, the Managing Director of Ipsos, so we appreciate them hosting this session. We welcome everybody from around the world that's participating in this, especially our Singapore and our Hong Kong Marketing Society members. So today we want to have this as an interactive, engaging discussion. We're also going to have several polls with you. So feel free to move around your video screens. On the right, you will see questions. You can input your questions at any time to us. We'll interact and engage with them. And also, if we don't get to them, we'll also definitely email you directly immediately afterwards. And don't worry, there's a lot of slides coming. So we will also be able to send you the entire report that you'll be able to review on your own. So with that, let's get things going. Mick, so what do we expect to see and hear today?
Okay, thank you, Darren. So thank you very much for the time today, for joining us. We're going to present some information from several different surveys and pieces of research that we did at the back end of 2019 and early 2020. We're going to look at perceptions of 2019. We're going to have a look at behavior of affluent consumers in Hong Kong and Singapore. We're going to have a look at things that worry the world and also some predictions for 2020. Then we're going to take a look at the difference between the perceptions and the realities around a particular issue, and finally take a look at COVID-19 and some data that we've collected recently on that. The information I'm going to share, as I mentioned, has really been collected at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. So COVID-19 wasn't really happening, or was just starting to happen then. So there are some interesting themes which I think will be consistent, but we always have to read these now, given that these are very, very interesting and different times, with a certain question about, how will COVID-19 affect these predictions going forward. But I think it's going to be interesting, and we'll reference that as we go through.
Okay. Well, let's get going.
Okay. So we'll start by looking at how the world felt 2019 went. And the short answer is much of the world felt that 2019 was not a good year. As you can see here, looking at many countries across the world, the majority of those respondents said 2019 was a bad year. It's perhaps a little more encouraging for us in Asia. Many of the Asian markets, which you can see in the lighter color, were the more optimistic markets. However, Hong Kong, not surprisingly, was pretty pessimistic and negative about 2019. It was a tough year for all of us, those of us who've lived through it, and that's reflected in the responses. When we asked how do people feel about the year for them and their family, we saw very similar patterns, but something that we will see as a bit of a theme going through this whole presentation, which is that actually people tend to see things a little bit more positively from a personal perspective than from an overall perspective. They're more pessimistic about the externalities than the personal experience. But nevertheless, you see again, Hong Kong pretty pessimistic, Singapore much more optimistic about the experience of 2019. Now, if we then jump on and look at how people felt about their market, and I will refer to markets because Hong Kong isn't officially a country, but most of the markets we're talking about are countries other than Hong Kong. And what we can see is that when asked, how do you think your market is it going in the right direction? What we saw was that 60% of the population feel that it's not going in the right direction. About 30+% think it's going in the right direction. And when we look at the reasons, we can see there are a number of reasons around poverty and social issues, social inequality, unemployment, crime and violence, financial and political crime, and healthcare. Looking at it by a country or market basis, the striking thing is that most countries are pretty pessimistic, but there are one or two significant outliers. The most significant being China, incredibly optimistic. 90% believe that China was on the right track at the end of last year. We can speculate, and we have some data that indicates that perhaps there's a slight more negative perspective in China right now because of the experience of COVID-19. But we've also seen, as we've tracked this over recent years, that China is consistently very, very positive in its outlook. And another market for similar reasons that tends to be very positive is India. You know, a huge opportunity and growth.
So I think it's interesting also that how at 90%, that is extremely high.
Yeah,
And obviously through after the COVID, you know, process, I imagine this is still an underlying belief, right?
Yes, I think there will be. Sorry, let me skip back a moment. When we look at a little bit more recent data here, which is confidence measures, what you can see is over a long period, China has been very, very confident about the economic outlook. The United States also has a high level of confidence. It's been a pretty healthy run economically under the Trump regime, significantly ahead of the global average. But I draw your attention to the last bit of this graph, which is really that this runs up until the early February. There's quite a significant drop in confidence, sudden drop in confidence in China. Now, historically, what we've seen is that confidence bounce backs very quickly. I think COVID-19 is a slightly exceptional event. We're not quite sure how significant and how long it will last, but you know, history suggests that China will bounce back, and even in you know, at the end of January, given the experience in China, it's still a more optimistic outlook even than the US. So.
Well, it's also interesting that both United States and China economies, the two world's largest economies, are certainly the one that are showing that much higher than the rest of the global economies.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so let's do a quick poll with the audience and see what they think, if that matches up with what we've seen. And generally speaking, would you guys say that things are heading in the right direction or off in the wrong direction? So you have about 10 seconds. You can just click whether they're heading in the right direction or in the wrong direction, and we'll see what the audience thinks about this. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Let's get ready to close. Okay, let's show the results. So in essence, 18% think we're on the right direction, 82% thinking we're on the wrong direction. That's a shocking number.
Well, actually, given the experiences of the current climate, the events that are happening in Europe, beginning to happen in the US, I'm not surprised by that. You know, I think it's. I don't think we have a particularly pessimistic audience. We probably have a very realistic audience given the circumstances we're facing. When we look at the track of this issue about how do you think things are going, are they in the right direction or not, over the last 8 years, it's surprisingly consistent. It's surprisingly consistent. About 60% of people think that things are not going in the right direction any time. Market to market, there's a bit more fluctuation, but it sort of pans out overall. It will be interesting to see whether that consistency remains through this year, given the situations that we're facing. Okay, let's take a slightly different direction and look at behavior of the affluent community, specifically in Hong Kong and Singapore, and comparing them really over the second half of last year. We're doing this because there's quite a significant events in Hong Kong in the second half of 2019, and it's interesting to make that comparison with Singapore for both parts of the audience. This is based on a continuous program we do of researching the top 20% of the population globally, actually, but all across Asia. But we've just picked out the two markets that we're addressing today. Well, the first thing we saw over the second half of last year was a decline really in consumption generally, and particularly a decline in consumption amongst the Hong Kong affluents. We also saw a distinct decline in confidence amongst the Hong Kong affluents, but not amongst the Singaporeans. Quite really, things held up amongst the Singaporeans. And that confidence changed was evidenced in the way that they chose to make their investments. We looked a little bit at their financial behaviours, and you can see that actually that nearly half of the Hong Kong affluents were looking at specifically more conservative investment approaches in the second half of last year. And we're going to have a look at some of the kind of parts of different angles of that investment strategy briefly. Interesting that both sides were very focused on diversification as an approach. This is something that we will see more at the moment as well, that in times of difficulty, in times of uncertainty, diversification is one of the strategies, a sort of safety strategy, really. The areas that Hong Kong affluence diversified into, they moved away from things like stocks, and they moved into things like gold, like insurance-based products, places of safety, really, in terms of where to put their money. And where did they go to locationally? They moved away from Hong Kong. They moved away from China. They looked to USA and Singapore as the markets that they wanted to invest in. If we overlay that with the Singaporeans, actually we see quite a similar pattern, with the very positive aspect that Singaporeans were heavily moving their money back home and investing in their local market. That reflects the confidence in the local market and the concerns about markets outside like Hong Kong and indeed potentially China and Europe. And you know, the whole thing stacks up to what we're seeing here, which is there was a significant decline in optimism in Hong Kong, and actually quite positively optimistic in Singapore.
And you've been doing the study for many years now. Is this due to the last challenges we've had in Hong Kong in the last year? This is a huge number here, but in past years, was it closer, or is it been in over time pretty much in this type of proportion, with Hong Kong having a lot more pessimism?
I mean, this is certainly a significant movement, you know, and we don't always make a comparison directly between these two markets. It's an interesting comparison to make because, you know, they are essentially competitive in some aspects, but we don't always make that comparison. But yes, I think, you know, there were exceptional times in Hong Kong last year, and we can see that in some of the other data we'll be looking at. Final point I would make in terms of places that people are looking to put their money is there's also definitely looking for secure brands, big brands, brands that they can trust, that are going to be around, that have stability. And again, this is something we will see more of on a broader scale than just Hong Kong this year, where people will move to brands that they feel that are going to be safe, that are going to survive the economic turmoil. And so, you know, the high levels of trust in the big names, in the big brands. So let's skip on to things that worried the world, what the things that were worrying the world at the beginning of this year. I'm going to start with another poll.
Okay, so in this poll, let's say, which of the following topics do you think have been the most worrying in your market? Poverty and social inequality we're seeing across the globe, unemployment, crime or violence, healthcare, or education is the most worrying in your market. So we'll give you a few seconds to click in on that, and we'll check the results. Okay, let's check the results. 53% poverty and social inequality, 32% unemployment. That's, of course, I think part of the current challenging market that's driving that. But poverty and social inequality has definitely been playing an important role across global issues most recently.
Absolutely, absolutely. Actually, that reflects the data that we have globally. As you can see, we gave you the top categories in our survey, and you picked the top one. Poverty and social inequality is the biggest single concern globally, but closely followed by a small group of others, which are the ones that we listed out to you. Let's have a look at how that's tracked over the last 8 years. So if we look at the movement between poverty and social inequality and unemployment, unemployment for a number of years was the most significant concern. It has been overtaken recently by poverty and social inequality. And I think that this is connected really to the change in economic and employment structures that we see around the world. Unemployment is perhaps less of a risk in environments of gig economy and that sort of activity. The concern is that you may have notionally unemployment, but how many hours are you going to get? You know, when will you get your next paycheck? How secure is this? And also actually that those employments often don't provide very good financial remuneration. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the move away from explicit unemployment as the major concern and towards inequality and poverty. If we look at the other three factors, very quickly step through them. Financial and political corruption, it fluctuates a bit, but it's been pretty consistent really over the years, as has crime. The other one that I think is an interesting one to pick out here is healthcare, which historically of these has been the least concern of the top five, but is the one that's actually growing fastest. And I think that's only going to continue at the moment with all the challenges that the healthcare systems are going to face in pretty much everywhere around the globe this year. But it is a growing, it was before even COVID-19, it was a growing concern about the provision of healthcare globally. This is from a very comprehensive survey that we just completed looking at global trends around the world. And this actually is part of a much bigger presentation. I'm just going to use it to give a little bit of a flavor, a couple of points, but it's something we can perhaps come back to. Some of our colleagues in Singapore do a very big program presenting this. But just to share with you a couple of relevant parts of this, the concern about wealth distribution and social inequality as an impact on society, something that we picked out as the concern in the poll, is a major issue across the globe. It's a very significant issue in all countries, even in the US, which I think is a country that it tolerates a level of inequality, sees it as part of a very individualistic society. Still, a majority of people are very concerned about that issue.
But it's interesting when you look at the top from perspective, even China at 85%, it's very important. But the U.S., where even in social and elections cycle now, where you see it still only 55%.
Yeah.
Also at home, please feel free at your offices, wherever you might be connecting in from. There's a questions, send your questions to us. We can get to them. Just type them in on the little sidebar there.
Another associated impact or trend that we've seen is a hankering for the past, a hankering for better days. 64% of people said they are happier lives in the old days. And again, you can see that that's quite a widespread feeling across many markets. China being one of the outliers there, but there's no wishing for the past in China, or very little, but many other markets, it's an issue. If we look at healthcare, just to quickly round up this part, we can see that the healthcare is obviously quite a concern in a number of markets. We've seen that, the concern overall, but it's quite a diverse it's spread in terms of how important a concern it is. It's a really big issue in China, which is obviously an interesting and significant opportunity potentially. As a UK national, I'm not surprised to see it's quite an important issue in the UK. It's been sort of an obsession, the healthcare provision and the National Health Service for a number of years. I honestly don't know what's happening in Hungary, but
I was going to say, as you look down, or even India, such a low percentage for this issue in healthcare.
Yes, and I think that reflects a little bit that healthcare comes in as a sort of a slightly higher level need compared to perhaps some level of financial security. So perhaps as the Indian economy matures, that'll rise as an issue. Okay, so let's have a look at some predictions for 2020. Again, this is predictions taken at the beginning of the year. We're going to look at around 4 buckets, and I'm going to skip through these a bit quickly. As with all of this, you'll get the deck. There's a lot more data if you're interested behind pretty much every slide, a lot more breakdowns. So do come back to us if there's something that matters or is interesting to you as an audience. So if we take a look first of all at world affairs, we can see that 77% of the population expect global temperatures will rise this year. About a third of the population believe there's going to be a stock market crash, that Trump's going to be elected president, that we're going to have a terrorist event, and there'll be a natural disaster. And 15% of the population expect that we will be visited by aliens this year.
Well, we're going to get a little deep dive on each one of these now, actually, because there's little interesting stories with every slide.
Okay, well, yes. So average global temperature rises will pretty globally understood that global temperatures will rise, and particularly Asian markets, Hong Kong, Singapore, very high levels of awareness and expectation that will happen. I think it's quite interesting to look right at the bottom of the list here, that the United States and Saudi Arabia, two markets, still the majority of people believe temperatures will rise, but given one is the largest producer of fossil fuels in the world and the other is the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world, one wonders whether there's a certain degree of desire to not acknowledge this issue. I mean, we're not actually suggesting in this deck, in this question, that the cause is, but I think there's a connection with the resistance to acknowledge that challenge. So if we go to the global trends piece and look at the question, climate change currently seeing, is it a result of human activity? Overwhelmingly, the global population believe, yes, this is a real effect, and it's human activity that's causing the impact. But again, you see the US is right at the bottom of that in terms of numbers of people acknowledging it. It's still a majority, though, even in the US.
But I mean, it's interesting because it's also, we're headed for environmental disaster unless we change our habits. And it's you look at some of the countries that are at the top at 95%, Indonesia, Colombia 94%, Mexico 93%. But yet it's an interesting perspective on a thought versus how does it come back to actions as well.
Some of those markets probably also are feeling the experiences. I mean, in Indonesia, I imagine that there's a lot more significant and real impact on a day-to-day basis. So global stock markets, I think that probably today, if we measure this again, it would look even more likely for most people. A lot of Asian markets are pretty pessimistic. I think it is likely that there will be a stock market crash this year. Singapore, Hong Kong, right up there. And I can only imagine that measure, if we took it again today, would be even more significant. There's an expectation amongst quite a significant portion that Trump will be re-elected. That's very much a moving feast at the moment as well, of course. What I find interesting here is the markets which are most optimistic about Trump being re-elected. Some of those markets are markets that have sensed benefits, particular benefits from Trump. The US itself, in terms of economic success, has perhaps benefited. India has had quite a positive response and experience with the Trump regime, so has Israel. And actually, I think the reason we see Hong Kong right up there is probably because also Trump was seen as an implicit supporter of some of the democratic campaigning that was going on in Hong Kong in 2019.
Still interesting enough, there's overall, if you look at likely 35%.
Yes.
And the other markets. So it'll be interesting to watch towards November and see how the predictions do play out.
Well, in the United States, 46%, which is not far away from, I think, what is actual. We can see also quite a high level of expectation of terrorist attack. The markets at the top of here are really the markets that have recently experienced terrorist incidents, particularly France and Great Britain. There's quite a high level of awareness and alerts to that issue. And aliens. Interesting that for me that Singapore and Hong Kong track above average in terms of their expectations that we're going to be visited by aliens.
But India at 37% is interesting. Hong Kong at 23%. Sometimes the more I'm watching all of the social media posts, I believe that we've been invaded by aliens already.
I don't. It's difficult to explain this. Possibly. Some people think about aliens as people simply not necessarily visiting Earth, but visiting their environment from other environments, so rather than actually extraterrestrials. Okay, looking at society and culture, half the population believe there's going to be some level of public unrest in their country in 2020. Almost half the population believe that women will be paid the same as men in 2020. Possibly that's the male half, I don't know. And also, I pick out that a third of the population expect to be lonely for a significant proportion of the time in 2020. So let's have a look at that public unrest factor. We don't have data here for Hong Kong. It was felt that would be a question that would be difficult to ask in Hong Kong politically. What we do see is that Singapore, along with Japan, has famously stable environments is right at the bottom of the here, the very low expectation of any public unrest. And actually, Asian markets generally, the ones that we've asked, have quite positive, relatively positive numbers. So I imagine the women on this webcast might cast a wry smile at this data, but the survey information says that 44% of the global surveyed population believe that women will be paid the same for men for the same work in 2020. And actually, it's particularly high level of belief in a number of Asian markets. As you can see, the yellows are at the top of the chart.
But isn't that, it's really interesting when I look at Philippines, India, Malaysia, that's 75%, 62%, Hong Kong, 62% believe this. Whereas I look at the developed nations of France, Germany, the other ones, it's so low.
Yes,
where they've been brought this up to the biggest, attention, social media attention that we've seen, but yet in those markets, why is it so much higher?
Well, I would speculate that it's perhaps the difference between the optimism for the future and the experience of reality, which perhaps, particularly in Europe, there's been a lot of efforts, political efforts, or and legislation to try and address these issues. And the impact has not been as significant as would have been hoped. And so I think there's a lot more pessimism there than there's a belief that perhaps more optimism about how things could be done from actually probably a less actually having been done probably in Asia in relative terms so far. And such a large proportion of people expect to feel lonely in 2020 is quite a striking piece of information. And actually, again, we look at the Asian markets, and they tend to be up there. India, China markets, Malaysia, very, very populous countries for a start, and very, very dynamic environments. But loneliness seems to be a really big issue, and I think this is a very interesting area for consideration for providers of healthcare and insurance, because it talks to issues around mental health. But it's also an important issue for all businesses, in the sense that there is a growing expectation that businesses take some responsibility for the mental well-being of their staff. And I know I'm slightly extrapolating, but if we use issues of senses of loneliness and isolation to be potential indicators of concerns around health and well-being, emotional and mental health and well-being, this is, I think, an issue that is a growing issue that businesses are going to need to look at in the coming years. Technology. People are going to spend more time online than watching TV in 2020 than they did in 2019, and they did in 2019 and 2018. That's it's something that there's a continuing pattern. They're moving from traditional TV to to streaming services. There's a very significant proportion of the population, nearly 40%, expect to be hacked in 2020. Expect that, and I think the final measure here is also quite a surprising one, that a growing group of the population are actually looking to use social media less. I think that speaks to some of the concerns and the negative influences of social media. So if we look at social media, you can see that there's it's quite diverse here. There doesn't seem to be an obvious pattern in terms of geography, but I think this is speaks to the concerns about the negative side of social media, the awareness that of the impacts on people. I think the reasons, perhaps, for example, in Singapore and Hong Kong, that this is perhaps a little below average in terms of the concern would be there. Certainly, in Hong Kong, there's been some significantly positive uses of social media, at least in terms of ways of communicating and sharing information in 2019 around the demonstrations. Linked to that, part of our global trends survey, looking at people's willingness to share information. One of the interesting growing trends here is that we see is that the general public is becoming more comfortable sharing data with businesses in return for enhanced business services, products and services. This is particularly so in places like China and India, where often there's whole new rafts of service have been able to be provided through these channels that weren't available before. But it's something that's generally growing across the globe, and an acceptance. It's not universal by any means, but an increasing acceptance of this trade-off of some personal information in terms of getting back services. It's noticeable, though, that when we're looking at government use of information, there's quite a high concern still about, and that varies a lot, of course, from market to market, depending on the nature of the government. The outlook for 2020. I think we'll just pick out a couple of themes here. The first thing is that actually people were, at the beginning of the year, more optimistic. 75% were more optimistic about 2020 than 2019. I'm not sure whether we'd still see that number, to be honest, right now. As you can see, a lot for the global economy in 2020 would be stronger than 2019, particularly those big sort of growing markets, China, Philippines, India. So a lot of Asian markets are very optimistic at the beginning of this year. Of course, things have changed a bit. Hong Kong, quite pessimistic, but again, we know that there's plenty of reasons in 2019 for a fairly pessimistic perception. And actually, Hong Kong's issues of 2019 haven't really been resolved. As we know, they've really just been put on the back burner by other issues, particularly COVID-19 at the moment. Generally, they're coming back to that theme about the personal being more optimistic than the collective. More optimistic, similar patterns, similar sort of positioning of the different markets, but more optimistic on a personal level than on a country or market level. Okay, so let's skip on quickly to looking at perceptions. And here this is a program we do annually, and we always pick a different theme when we look at how perceptions vary against against reality. And after having a look at causes of death, we will look at one potentially imminent cause of death, which is COVID-19. So we'll have a look at the general pattern, and then we'll have a look at some new data around COVID-19 to close the session. So let's start with a poll.
Okay, so the third poll is globally, what do you think is the biggest cause of death across all ages? And this was interesting, perception versus reality. So we're going to show you the reality in a second, but what is your perception that is the biggest cause of death across all ages? Another couple seconds. Okay, let's close it out and let's see what the audience thinks. 47% think cardiovascular disease. So our audience is very in tune with the truth behind this.
A well-educated audience,
yes.
I'm reassured. Yes. So let's have a look at. So these are the key causes of death globally. The two that really account for nearly almost 60% of all deaths around the world are cardiovascular diseases such as heart disease and cancer. And then we have neurological diseases, and then obviously a long list of others. So you're pretty much correct at the group that polled here. If we overlay what the general public think, general public are much less accurate than the community that we're talking to today. Significantly underestimate the impact of cardiovascular diseases, of cancers, neurological diseases, and significantly overestimate some of the lesser impacts: terrorism, substance abuse, violence.
I mean, transport injuries as well was interesting. Everyone thinks that was a lot higher than it actually was.
Absolutely. We'll take a little look at that and speculate on some of the reasons behind that. Here's the same information stacked, so you can just see the differences in terms of over and underestimations for the globe. So let's have a look first of all at cancer. Well, both Singapore and Hong Kong significantly underestimate cancer as a cause of death. Hong Kong very significantly, a real outlier. Now, there are a host of reasons for this. One is that cancers affect a wider age group of people, and they're not, in a sense, newsworthy. They're not dramatic. So it kind of goes under the radar, perception radar. People aren't as aware of it unless it's a personal impact. It doesn't get a lot of media coverage. It's not dramatic, and it doesn't affect young people. And it affects so much. I mean, it does affect young people, but not so much. And I think often it's young tragic deaths that raise a lot of awareness, not only media but also just in general communication. And I think for that reason, and for those reasons, we see the same, the opposite track when we look at some of these more dramatic, if you like, more newsworthy causes of death. So substance abuse, alcohol and other substance abuse. Hong Kong, again, very significant overestimator. So is Singapore, but less so. And the same story, really, if we look at travel accidents, Hong Kong, again, I picked this out because Hong Kong is the most overestimated. Singapore overestimates, but less so.
But it's kind of interesting why that's overestimated so much more. I mean, we hardly ever hear of accidents. Maybe the transportation of the buses recently has increased that, but
I think it is. We'll see in a moment that one of the connections is towards what's reported in the media, what's newsworthy, and certainly when you look at things like homicide and murder, which we're looking at here again, you know, they're very newsworthy, so they tend to people tend to be very aware of them. We'll see the more aware they are in terms of news, the more likely they are to overestimate these impacts. And so here we can see actually that things that are reported a lot in the news are in Hong Kong. Interpersonal violence, transport injuries is the most significant amongst the community we asked. They were saying, yes, this is one of the things we see most frequently in the news, and as a consequence, it's one of the most overestimated. Similarly, in Singapore, we see that cancer is more news about cancer, and actually Singapore was much better at estimating the real impact of cancer, probably partly due to that. We can also, if we look at within our population, those who were aware that they were seeing a lot of information about the particular issue, they overestimated more than the core population. So here we see in Hong Kong, everybody's massively overestimating the impact of transport. But if you see a lot about it in the media, instead of 9%, you're estimating it's as much as 12% as a percentage of causes of death. And we see a similar pattern again with interpersonal violence. So there's a pattern. The more people are aware of these things in the media, the more they tend to overestimate them. And as we can see here also, there's also a connection in terms of control. If people feel they can't control a problem, if they feel they can't control, they tend to overestimate it. So actually with cancer, one of the challenges is that cancer is often, many forms of cancer are controllable, but there's still a perception that it's not controllable. So some places that tends to get overestimated. One of the things I think that's important in communication is perhaps to be able to make comparative measures. I'll make a very facetious one, which is the difference, what's more likely to cause death, coconuts or sharks? And the answer is coconuts. Coconuts, because you're far more likely to be hit on the head by a coconut and die than you are to be killed by a shark. But that's not the perception. So if you make the comparison, that sort of gets the message over.
Shark's a little bit more exciting. But
yeah, exactly.
I don't want to get hit by a coconut and go out.
And terrorism is more exciting than cancer in the same frame. It's a little bit of a facetious way of putting it. But, yeah. Okay, so let's have a look at COVID-19 finally. This is some information. We're running a program which collects data over a couple of weeks on COVID-19 across a number of markets, and we share it with our clients. We're not sharing this in sort of, we're careful about the way that we share this because, it can be quite sensitive, but it's very useful for our clients to understand this. So I'm going to share a few bits of this, just some highlights, and also a little bit of information from our colleagues in China about some of the experiences and the ways that they've dealt with it, because obviously China's a little bit ahead of everybody else on this one at the moment. So the first thing I wanted to point out is we see again this pattern about the more personal it becomes, the less concerned people are relatively. So the pale blue line shows how worried are people about coronavirus for the world, and very worried across many markets. This was taken at the end of February. We would expect, we know because the data has been collected now, that these numbers are going to rocket in Italy, for example, because things are really, this is part of the volatility of this situation. things are happening very quickly. So sensitivity on these measures is very high at the moment. But as you can see, the more you bring it to a personal, the less worried people are in relative terms. They're still worried. There is a growing worry about the impact on the global economy. The measure here is mid-February and end of February. Say we'll have another measure coming out pretty soon. I don't doubt that we're going to see further concerns in many markets. And the worry is growing. Actually, it's growing faster. It's coming home in a sense. People are more worried personally, more worried about their jobs and their businesses.
And I'm curious about Vietnam. I saw on the last couple screens that Vietnam was the top of the charts from their own country, but global perspective as well. Why do you think that Vietnam is ranking at way above the rest of the world?
I think there was specific concerns in Vietnam around the end of February. I think there was Vietnam obviously is quite reliant on China, so there's a big commercial impact on them when things started to close down in China, but also a lot of Chinese visitors. So there's a lot of concern about transmission from visitors. So I think it's a high level of concern. I think this is very volatile though, so I wouldn't necessarily expect that to be a standout number in the next wave. I don't know, but I would speculate that we might well see Italy numbers rocket because it's a very, very live issue in Italy right now. There's a thirst for information, which is not surprising. Everywhere there's a lot more interest in news than there was a month ago. And the interest is across a lot of platforms, particularly news websites and TV news channels, but actually it's quite indiscriminate. People are looking at all sorts of different places for information, thirst for knowledge, thirst for information, and not many really looking at places that you might consider the most likely to be authoritative, World Health Organization or perhaps government websites, but a big demand for information. Now, if we step back and have a look at something connected to this, which is from our global trends, which is around the belief in vaccines, because obviously this is going to matter.
It's definitely a top topic across the world right now.
So reassuringly, displaying a bias, I guess, but I'm going to admit to a bias here. Reassuringly, the majority of the population do believe in vaccines, but there is a significant proportion of people that don't, and that includes in some markets where, like China. China's way towards the bottom of this list. It's a significant portion of people don't have great belief in vaccines for them and their family. And this is, a big challenge potentially if we get to the stage where we have a vaccine for COVID-19. It's also interesting to look at what people trust in terms of information sources. People want to hear from on these sort of issues. People want to hear from doctors and scientists. They don't want to hear from politicians. And at the moment, as we've seen, they're hearing from lots and lots of different sources, and there's lots of confusion about the information available to people. Okay, so let's quickly have a look at some things that our colleagues in China have shared with us about the experience really in January in China. So first things are, what were people doing and not doing? They weren't going out. That's not surprising. I mean, this isn't just in Wuhan, obviously, this is across the whole of China. People were going out less, they were staying at home, they were spending money on things like medical supplies, on food. They're a lot more involvement in online services. That's not surprising. I think we'd see similar patterns in Hong Kong around these things. A lot less spending on offline sports and clothing, beauty products, those kind of things. The Chinese team also took a look at some of the things that were going on, what brands were doing to address the challenges, the experiences of life with COVID-19 in China. And we're just going to step through a couple of those and look at some examples. These examples are based in China. They may not be directly applicable in other markets. They may look a little bit odd, but I think the overall sense of what they're trying to do is interesting to look at. So first thing that they said is that it's really important you don't look to be opportunistic, you don't look to exploit the situation by perhaps outrageous pricing strategies. Picked out a Dutch consumer company here that recognized that they couldn't provide the supply to meet the demand, so actually chose to try and suppress demand a bit by reducing their marketing, so they didn't create demand they couldn't fulfill. They adjusted their pricing strategy to try and balance out supply and demand. Louis Vuitton took the line of just acknowledging the challenge for their customers, showing empathy, showing sympathy. Now, again, whether this feels like the right style in Hong Kong or Singapore, questionable, but looking at the intent, trying to give comfort and support. Number of brands found ways to be supportive, to offer something back to their consumers. So Lush made their shops available for people to wash their hands and use their products, which also has a nice side effect for them, or pass through traffic. Many airlines were pragmatic about rebooking and cancellations, showing a level of understanding for their customer base and avoiding actually being seen as unsupportive and negative. And of course, Amazon made big efforts to try and avoid outrageous pricing of goods and services. Some brands also chose to try and bring some style to the event. Here we have Fendi and others producing the designer face masks for their customers. So it's a little bit more seriously, and common sense, a lot of businesses looked at how can we deliver our services in different ways, and again, we've seen that in Hong Kong. We see businesses avoiding formal conferences and formal meetings and having online engagements, as we're doing today. Automakers focusing on online sales. I mean, automotive sales have absolutely crashed in China, but China partly because nobody wants to go into showrooms. So looking at other ways to sell cars, because there is actually an underlying indicator that a number of Chinese are thinking that they should buy cars in order to avoid getting on public transport going forward. So there is potentially a market there if you can access it. And museums and art galleries starting to do virtual events. They can't get people into their buildings or aren't allowed in their buildings, so they've started to create virtual events that people will experience things online.
And I think it's also interesting that's unlocking the opportunities.
Yeah.
I mean, while we are looking at doing virtual meetings, canceling all of these social gatherings, it's really helping the businesses to start looking at things from a different perspective as well.
Absolutely.
How do we, as online commerce has boomed in China and growing here in Hong Kong, it's what other opportunities can we tap into that we haven't really had as part of our core operating structure.
Absolutely, and we see it with our clients. A lot of our clients have moved from a very defensive approach in the early days of simply shutting offices and slowing everything down to proactively thinking, well, how can we work differently, not only in terms of our own business, but how can we deliver our services differently? How can we get to our customers, our clients in new ways that address the realities that everybody's facing? And I guess it's connected to that. A number of businesses looking to inspire people with things to do, things to do when if they're going to be self-quarantined, if they're in their homes. How can we engage with them? How can we give them interesting things to do that connect to our brand to make us part of the solution? And comedy, making a bit of a joke of it. It's a very careful, delicate one, and I'm not claiming that necessarily these two examples are particularly funny from my perspective, but they played in China well.
But I think it's also interesting that branded content is playing such an important role now in connecting and helping to get your brand message across. And laughter, I was just watching the MTR system in Thailand. They just had a whole dance number and musical number about how to wash your hands, keep your social distance, all the things around COVID-19, and they found that sense of humor, which was a great way to educate their population in a fun and engaging way versus a threat or scare tactic.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking to a marketing community, so these guys know plenty about this thing. But yes, you just need to think carefully about what you're being funny about, because it could be backfire terribly if you misjudge it. I think the final point is really that one that we've been leading up to in this section really anyway, that there are opportunities, and many brands will be able to make use of these opportunities. Many brands made great use of the opportunity in the 2008 crash to develop their businesses, to provide services that were relevant and meaningful in that context. And there are businesses that are already finding ways to do the same in this context. So very quickly, a roundup. I think first thing I would want to say is, yes, there's a lot of economic pessimism, particularly for Hong Kong. Hong Kong had a tough 2019, and we're facing similarly tough conditions in 2020, or perhaps even more tough. general pessimism, simple, less pessimistic, a little more optimistic with good reason at the beginning of the year. But again, I think everybody's now experiencing great concerns about what's going to happen next. You know, there's quite a lot of pessimism. There's also definitely a clear trend in concern about social worries, inequality, healthcare provision, particularly. And again, you know, I think healthcare provision is a worry that's only enhanced at the moment. It is only going to continue to grow over the next few months, and probably is going to be a big theme throughout 2020. We also see that there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misperceptions about things. We looked particularly at the issues about causes of death, but a lot of misperceptions, a lot of uncertainty. These things actually do provide opportunity. The opportunity, first of all, for brands to help bridge the gap, help people to address people's perceptions and bring them to reality, to be part of the communication strategy, both as a social good, but also as an effective way for brands to actually engage with people. If you understand where they are, as opposed to where they, you know, what the reality is, it's much easier to start moving their mindset towards wherever you want them to be. So, you know, understanding that gap can be both, and bridging that gap can be both valuable socially, but also valuable in terms of commercially. I think what we've seen is a great desire for stability and security, and we saw it particularly in the financial data, people seeking stability and security, but actually there's an underlying theme in a number of areas of that need in uncertain times. And a lot of our data, as I said, was measured at the beginning of this year. Things have only got more uncertain, significantly more uncertain since then. So I think that message really does hold up and remain true. The final point I would say is that relatively, I think Asia is a more optimistic environment than many of the others. We see that many of the Asian markets are quite optimistic on many of the measures, and although Asia has had some really big challenges around COVID-19, arguably Asia's a little bit ahead of the curve and perhaps more likely to come out of that challenge earlier. So I think, again, you know, there is real opportunity and also learnings to be had in Asia that can be applied elsewhere. So I think there's, you know, in relatively in tough times, there is still opportunity in our markets here.
Well, so we had this question in reference to how do you tell the difference between the perception and reality? How can brands move towards closing that gap and bridging towards an optimistic approach?
Right, yes. Well, the way we technically measure the difference between perception and reality is obviously we ask the population about their perceptions about different things, and we gather independent data through sources like the World Health Organization, through you know, in Hong Kong, the hospital authorities data. That's where we get it. So we get, you know, the facts, the reality, and we compare them against what the opinions are. And we do that annually. And actually, if you go back to if you look up Perils of Perception there's an open website with data around lots of different themes that we've done over the years. And actually, there's even a book written by the guy that set this up, who's now an academic in one of the UK universities, around this whole challenge. And he addresses how you can sort of utilize, if you like, this opportunity, this gap.
There was a question that's asking it, you know, if we had any interesting business as usual aspects in terms of marketing activities or key things that we should be operating or working towards during this COVID period.
I don't have any data that addresses that question directly, but I mean, I think I can say things that perhaps wouldn't be a great surprise to anybody, given the professionals that we're speaking to. But you know, you need to stay engaged. You need to stay. That's obvious. You know, we as a business need to stay engaged with our clients. Everybody needs to stay engaged. What I think it would be the big mistake, and is to sort of hibernate. And I think we saw that initially in Hong Kong. And I'm now not really talking about that. I'm just talking about the personal experience. There was a period of almost hibernation. A lot of businesses sort of began to shut down, began to close down. It was quite difficult to talk to clients. And I think that is not the solution. Obviously not. We've got to sort of find new communication channels. Face-to-face may not be a communication channel. Some platforms
I think that we're
change.
doing, like, Marketing Society, we have a WhatsApp group for the Marketing Society members in Hong Kong, Marketing Society members in Singapore, and we start to see an influx of people starting posting reports, posting inspirational stories, business stories and articles too. And I think that's the key thing that we're seeing is that take this time to be also planning for when we do come back. That we see a lot of the business now starting to say, if we don't start thinking about that now, we're going to be behind when we do catch up and come out of this COVID virus, which we will come out of. So I think it's really interesting that we engage and do this. But with that, we want to thank you all for joining us today, and appreciate Ipsos and all of that, and look forward to communicating with you all in some more virtual ways in the coming time. So have a great day and stay healthy.
Thank you.